So I guess we'll see if this topic will make for as fun of a video as I thought it would. Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we are talking about YA fiction, where you have a pretty diverse set of things that could be defined as quote-unquote YA. Well, the definition of what YA fiction actually is, I think, is a little bit more complicated. It's probably a good starting point for a video like this, but I don't want to get too in the weeds of like what is or isn't YA and what defines those types of things. I think YA means different things to different people, but there are certain degrees to which the actual content of a book should matter in the delineation of whether or not something is YA. Plenty of YA books these days do get into a little bit more of a sexual side of things, you know, teenagers and sex, that whole side of things. You know the drill. That's just kind of how things are. However, ironically enough, tons of quote-unquote YA books aren't actually meant for a YA audience. Very often, things tend to be kind of marketed as YA in kind of strange ways. For example, you have books like Nevernight Chronicle by J. Kristoff, which are marketed as YA because the protagonist is a teenage female, but that doesn't necessarily make a book YA. And if you're going to say that a book with as much sexual content, explicit content in this book is YA, that's probably not super appropriate, even in cases like Vampire Academy, where this is actually a pretty YA oriented book. Still, there's still plenty of sexual stuff within the series that kind of puts it in a league that's like, I don't know if I would recommend that to more family friendly type of readers. For example, like I said, certain things are marketed towards a certain audience that don't ultimately end up either being appropriate for that audience. In the case of, you know, J. Kristoff, where like it doesn't make sense for those books to be considered YA. They're not YA just because of the protagonist. That's kind of weird. And then you also have a lot of YA where, I don't know, maybe romantasy isn't necessarily a part of this specifically, but I feel like a not insignificant chunk of modern YA fiction is written by middle-aged women and marketed towards other, well, actually not marketed towards, being read primarily by other middle-aged women and not actually by the teenagers that they are purportedly marketed to. So they're called YA, even though YA audiences aren't actually who they're being read by or written for. It's kind of a weird dichotomy of like, well, what is and isn't YA at this point? Who knows? That's not even really the discussion of today's video. It's not necessarily a bad thing for certain YA books to have some sexual content. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just that, you know, these two aspects of what is and isn't YA, and the marketing of it and the actual audiences of it is so confused and jumbled up that it's just kind of confusing. In my opinion, this is mostly my opinion anyway, YA books, if you're going to label them as YA, should be for actual young adult audiences. So like teenagers, you know, not necessarily for people who are looking for smut in their books. Cough, cough, adult women. It's one of those things where I think that if you're looking for smut, if you're looking for sexual content in your books, that you should probably just read something that is actually focused on that content, like romance or erotica if you really want it that bad. It's more efficient in that way. I don't think that other content should be so infused with sex scenes if it's going to be marketed towards a YA audience. If it's an adult audience, that's fine, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But if you're marketing technically towards a YA audience, you're marketing towards teenagers, and I think that you should not be putting too much of the sexy times in books for teenagers. With that kind of rant being said and done, that is the entire point of what this video is for. I want to recommend in this video YA books that are actually YA, you know, appropriate for a young adult audience pretty much regardless of their background. For example, growing up in a Mormon household, anything that had sexual content was like not allowed, like explicitly not allowed. So I want to recommend books that, like, for example, if you want more family-friendly content, or if you're a parent and you have teenage readers and you want them to be reading things that aren't necessarily super laden with filth the way that a lot of quote-unquote YA is today, then these are probably some better recommendations for you. Or if you personally just don't really like sex scenes in your books and you don't want to read books that have that kind of stuff in it, again, these are going to be recommendations for that kind of thing. I mean, like, I kind of unironically really like Vampire Academy, actually. When I read that in high school, that's not the reason why I enjoyed the series, for example. In fact, it rather took me aback several times. So basically what I'm getting at, what is the point of this video? You can take this video in one of two primary directions, essentially. If you have kids and want a couple of recommendations, I got you. There is genuinely some content considered YA that is actually appropriate, and I want to recommend some of those series. No, porn is not, in fact, a good thing for anybody, but especially not for teenagers, so we're not going to talk about books with that kind of content in it. The second direction that you can take this video is if you want something easier to read, quicker, simpler, more like the kind of YA fun that you can get from shorter and simpler books of this type, because as we all know, we got plenty of that kind of material in other adult books. Maybe sometimes you just don't want to read it. So in either case, I have some recommendations for you. So sit back, relax, enjoy the show. Structured as follows. Honorable mentions. I will talk about a few series that I have not actually finished yet, but can still pretty confidently recommend in this context. And why I didn't finish some of these series will come up a little bit later after I go through those honorable mentions. Then I'll have a couple of other random standalone special picks that are easy to recommend from me and, kind of outside of the context of full-blown series. And then the actual top 5 part of this video, where I'll talk about series that I really love and would recommend broad scale for anybody looking for actual YA books that don't have any of the smut and garbage like that. Keep in mind, all 3 of these sets of recommendations are arranged from a younger audience to an older audience, so who they're more appropriate to. So some of these are going to be a little bit more middle grade oriented. Some of these are going to be more, explicitly YA, like teenager type level books, where like some of the content and the upper level recommendations aren't going to be appropriate for like middle school audiences, like thematically or something like that. And of course, all of this is kind of dependent on particular people, but I am arranging it this way in case you are looking for recommendations for different age ranges as well. It makes it pretty easy to kind of go through and cut a line where, maybe something isn't appropriate for your kid yet. The first honorable mention that I want to shout out is Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, do I really need to say anything about this series? Maybe you have some certain criticisms about some of the other content in the book, like the stereotypical witchcraft problems, but honestly, some of that stuff is whatever. Harry Potter is a series that I read the first couple of books for. These are definitely kind of in that middle grade kind of range in time. I understand that they get more mature as the books go on, and they get longer as the books go on as well, but at least for the first couple of books, these are kind of in that middle grade sphere and are definitely appropriate from that kind of family-friendly content perspective. Another honorable mention is going to be the Fablehaven series by Brandon Mull, which I think is a great, like, semi-portal fantasy type of book. Definitely on the more fable-oriented side of the fantasy spectrum, though. I think more of this series could more appropriately be considered middle grade, but I think by the last few books, even this kind of gets more towards a traditionally YA age range. I've read the first 2 books of this series as well. They're very good. I didn't finish the third one just from general series fatigue, something that I definitely suffered with for a lot of my time in school, for example. But Fablehaven is pretty good and definitely appropriate. I mean, it's written by a Mormon author, so of course it is not laden with sexual content. 11 Thumps is another great series in this regard. It's another portal fantasy series, but this time going to a dream world rather than a fantasy world within our world or anything like that. There's a lot of really imaginative sequences and characters from what I read of these books. I believe I read the first 2, and I don't know. I know I started the third one. I don't remember how far I got, but I didn't stick it through at the time, largely because of series fatigue, for example, which is going to be a trend for basically all of the series that I didn't finish. 11 Thumps is another great series in that regard. Ranger's Apprentice is a little bit longer as far as these YA series go, and this one is also really, really great. Pretty classic fantasy oriented as far as the vibe of this series goes. Some really cool plays on typical tropes that you'll see in Ranger's Apprentice. Not really much romance generally from the 5 books of the series that I have read. It seems like that might be a slight bit more of a focus in some of the later books. Like, it's not completely off the page, but whatever is there, it's definitely not getting inappropriate to any serious degree as far as that's concerned. And then the last honorable mention here is going to be The Maze Runner by James Dashner, which is definitely the most mature of these honorable mentions. This is a firmly YA series. I would not recommend this for middle graders, probably, unless it's like maybe 5th grade, if you consider that middle grade. Where you draw those lines for middle grade and YA might be different as well. That also complicates things, but this is one that I would definitely put in the firmly YA thing, but I'm fairly certain there's no explicit sexual deviancy within any of these books. You know, it's a pretty common theme with these LDS authors. I didn't realize how many of these authors are LDS, actually. There's a surprising amount of them. I read 1 book of The Maze Runner. That first book is incredible. It's still one of my favorites. I devoured that book. I struggled to read the second, and I don't know if that one was because of series fatigue or because of something with the book itself, or just because I was struggling to read at all at the time. I don't remember, but that was around the time that I kind of started a multi-year reading slump. So I don't know, but the first book was really good. I really liked that. And like I said, I'm pretty sure the rest of the series does not contain smut or anything remotely approaching that kind of thing. So the reasons that I didn't finish these books, I basically referenced already kind of implicitly through talking about them. The primary reason is burnout, usually series burnout, but kind of reading burnout in general. I discovered in junior high school that if I read too much of one author, one series, one world, or something like that at one time, like in a row, too many books in a row like that, it would just get to be too much, where even if I was enjoying what I was reading, I would just burn out and not want to read that book anymore. Even if I was enjoying it, it would be a thing where I could go a couple of years in between reading one book and the next, just because it would take a couple years to want to read back in that world again. It was definitely a pretty common theme back at the time. So many of these series that I didn't finish was because I was reading multiple books in a row and then would get to somewhere in the middle and kind of burn out on it. Ranger's Apprentice is a great example of this, where, well, maybe not a great example of this specifically, but like I read the first 2 books of Ranger's Apprentice a couple of times and struggled to get through the 3rd book each of those times. And then it took several years in the future for me to actually get through those first couple books and the 3rd book again, and then I got through 5, but I didn't continue beyond that point because of series fatigue. So like, definitely a major struggle for me, and has primarily motivated a lot of how I structure my TBR these days for the channel. It's why I basically never read books within a series back to back, and especially if they're not meant to be read back to back in that kind of way, where they're not like individual entries. If it's an actual contiguous series, I rarely do that kind of thing back to back anymore, because I could be loving a book and just drop it suddenly and not be able to pick it back up because of burnout, no matter how much I actually loved what I was reading. A secondary reason, I mentioned having a multi-year reading slump. I think a lot of this was depression related back in school years, that likely also exacerbated, you know, the kind of burnout problem. But losing interest in the things that I enjoyed otherwise was a common theme, of course. Generally, I found it really difficult to read at all because I just never really felt good, and that's a lot of why I had such a slump for so long. I found my solace in things like watching YouTube for the most part, in like high school particularly. Also video games starting in like 2019 with like Breath of the Wild, but late 2020 when I turned 18, playing single player story games was how I got a lot of my storytelling in, rather than reading. So like, there's not a lot of reasons why I DNF books these days. So you might be wondering, it's like, well, that's a lot of series you DNF'd. Yeah, it was just a complicated time in my life. So I didn't DNF any of these intentionally, actually. I would have read through all of these if I could have. Anyway, we're going to move on to the actual recommendations of the list, starting with just a couple of standalones on the author, Louis Satcher. Holes is more of a middle grade book, and Card Turner is more of a YA book. These are a couple of personal favorites. Holes is obviously a classic. Card Turner is just a personal favorite of mine for whatever reason. If you want more information about this book in particular, because everybody knows Holes, I do have a review of this. I have a review of Holes as well, but that was early on the channel. That might be a bad video, but in either case, I recommend those on the more standalone side of things. There are plenty of other authors as well that I could recommend, but those are some personal favorites. But now we're going to get into the actual top 5. These aren't necessarily indicative of my 5 favorite YA series, and definitely not necessarily in order of my favorite YA series, but these are some of my favorites nonetheless that I would definitely recommend to people looking for something in YA-oriented sphere that is not really approaching SMUT levels of that kind of content. As a reminder, this list in particular is going to be the most like middle grade to YA type of orientation. Like I said, this isn't an order of favorites, this is more an order of appropriateness. So let's start with the most middle grade of these picks. That is going to be 39 Clues, which is by various authors, but the first book of the first series is by Rick Riordan. This is the first book of the sequel series. I love 39 Clues. Absolute longtime favorites. I never finished the third series, and I'm pretty sure there's like 4 or 5 39 Clues series, but the first 2 series I absolutely adore and have read several times each time. That third series that I didn't finish was another one of those examples of falling victim to the burnout depression thing. But these are definitely pretty firmly middle grade. If you want books that you could plow through in a day, and I mean like literally plow through in a day, even if you read as slow as I do, and also don't spend as much time reading per day as some of the more crazy people that I know. These books, super easy, just a couple of hours long, basically, a few hours long maybe. Really short, really quick, really easy, really enjoyable for the content that they are. Maybe nostalgia goggles are kind of affecting that a little bit. I haven't reread 39 Clues recently enough to know. I plan to reread them pretty soon, but definitely longtime favorites. I think they're super short and snappy. Even younger me could read some of these books in a day, so I recommend these just because they're longtime favorites, but I'll probably be able to recommend them more strongly at some point in the future. Next up is The Underland Chronicles by Suzanne Collins, one of my favorite series. These bridge a little bit from that middle grade kind of spectrum in the first like 2 to 3 books. I mean, they're a little bit more mature and like they have giant rats and spiders and cockroaches and stuff. So like if your kid is freaked out by like critters and stuff like that, maybe don't give this to them to read, even if they are technically of the age to be able to read it well enough. So there's a little bit of like content specific type of stuff as far as fear is concerned with these. But from an adult content perspective, these are definitely YA for the first few books in terms of like violence and other thematic material. Middle grade for the first few books. Last couple books are definitely a little bit more mature. They're still written in that kind of middle grade type of sphere, but more mature emotionally. I love these books a lot. The first 3 of them are really simple. The last 2 make a very good climax. I haven't read The Hunger Games, but like as far as Suzanne Collins is concerned, if you're going to ask me to recommend her, I recommend Underland Chronicles. Like I said, it's kind of a bridge from middle grade to YA, so if your kid is okay with reading about giant critters and things like that, yeah, it's totally going to be a fun time for them as they grow up a little bit, I think. Percy Jackson and the Olympians and Heroes of Olympus as the sequel series. Kane Chronicles could also be involved here. Some of these series by Rick Riordan are things that I think are pretty good. This ranges from like Percy Jackson sort of being in a middle grade sort of sphere with a little bit of YA energy in the last couple of books, to some of the later entries being a little bit more firmly YA, like Heroes of Olympus and Kane Chronicles, I would say are just straight up YA, and that's probably true of Magnus Chase and Trials of Apollo, that's what it's called, but you know, Percy Jackson's a little bit more appropriate for a slightly younger audience in comparison, but in either case, I think that a lot of Rick Riordan's material is pretty appropriate, you know, as a kid gets older. If this list were ranked by like favorites or anything like that, Percy Jackson / Heroes of Olympus would probably be number 1 on this list. I still have some other series to reread before I would know for sure, but like as far as like content that makes certain ideas and concepts interesting to people, Percy Jackson is a super great and approachable book, and even if you're an adult, I think they hold up. Like genuinely, I really do. Percy Jackson is super great for that. Next up, number 2 in this list is going to be Probably the first entry here that I'm going to say this is YA. I would not recommend this to middle graders. This is definitely for teenagers. I Am Number 4, or the Lorien Legacy series. This series is incredible. We're starting to age some things up a little bit with things here. You have a concept of human-like aliens escaping a planet that was invaded to extinction and now being hunted again on Earth again to continue that extinction process. There's a really great concept here. I Am Number 4 is absolutely one of my favorite books of all time, and I think that this series is honestly really great for kind of content, generally speaking. There's a little bit that kind of romance tinge that some YA stuff tends to get into a lot of times, but none of it is super explicit so as to be actively inappropriate in a way that I would find like objectionable or really bad or something that you should need to worry about. Phoenix Island and Devil's Pocket, this duology, this is the shortest series that I'm talking about today, is my number 1 recommendation here. This is probably because these are thematically probably the most adult. I mean, I Am Number 4, that series could be considered as well, but like these two books are, in terms of like violence and kind of some of the other inspirations they draw from, like Dante's Inferno, for example, other kind of classic literature being alluded to, I guess. These two books are really enjoyable. Definitely a YA audience kind of thing going on here. They're also just a duology, so they're pretty approachable in that sense. They're a little bit more mature, like I said, on the violence angle. There's a little bit more of active commentary kind of going on, like about world and, people in general. But I would still say that that is still appropriate for teenagers, and also relatively thought-provoking on that side of things as well. So if you're looking for something pretty short and simple and you just want a couple of books, you don't want a whole series that you need to plow through, then Phoenix Island and Devil's Pocket do make a pretty good recommendation on that front. I also think that those two books really earn and deserve those kind of thematic ideas that they're trying to explore. An honest effort is being made within that YA context in a way that a lot of other books just aren't really trying to do if they're quote-unquote YA. So, that's going to be the video. That is basically my list of recommendations. I do think there are some things worth mentioning that I haven't quite touched yet. For example, I think Earthsea by Le Guin is generally considered to be pretty appropriate for a YA audience, where it's got a lot of mature focus, like thematically, and even like the prose, for example, but where the content itself is supposedly pretty family friendly. I don't know that for sure. I haven't read any Earthsea, but that's the impression that I've gotten. So definitely tell me if I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, warn people in the comments for sure. But I get the impression that that's kind of the way that things are going with that particular series. The Ender Saga by Orson Scott Card is also something that could be pretty capable for YA readers, but perhaps a little bit more morally complex. So one that's probably better to recommend for, at least on the kid side of things, for people who are, emotionally mature enough to kind of understand some of those ideas. You have a series that I started the first book for, but didn't finish because of that burnout type of thing, that depression thing back in junior high school. Seven Realms by, what's her name? Like Cinda Williams Chima or whatever her name is. Those books seem to be of that kind of older YA range. There might be some sexual stuff in those books though, so don't quote me on that one. And then Hunger Games is also kind of a thing that exists by Suzanne Collins, who we've talked about earlier, but I haven't actually read Hunger Games, so I can't speak to the quality of that. But either way, those are some YA series that I would recommend if you are looking for YA that doesn't have smut, whether that's for yourself or for a kid, it doesn't really matter. If you're looking for YA that is actually for YA audiences and not just labeled as YA because it has a teenage female protagonist or something like that, these are some of the series that I would recommend. Thank you for watching. If you did, I really appreciate it. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video, whatever that may be.